Thank you. Welcome everybody back to House General and Commerce. It's still Thursday, April 10th. We are taking testimony now in connection with a section of S-127, which is the Senate bill on housing, which is the analog to our housing bill, and which we now have possession of in this committee. That we are focusing on sections in that bill which are not in our housing bill, because we've already taken testimony on what's in our housing bill. At this point, we are going to take testimony on the subject of brownfield, specifically development dirt, which was a section that was originally in our bill, but was removed by us and is in the Senate bill. Our first witness will be Michael O'Grady. Michael?
Good morning. My name is Michael O'Grady with Legislative Council. I'm going to look at Section 10 of S-127 as passed by the Senate. I can work off of the side-by-side or the as-passed version. Looks like different people have different things. So I will try to be as clear as possible. First, what are development soils? So development soils are defined in statute as unconsolidated mineral and organic matter overlying bedrock that contains polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, arsenic, or lead in concentrations that exceed the relevant soil screening level for residential soil, and when managed in compliance with certain statutory sections, pose no greater risk than the agency established soil screening value for the intended reuse of the property, and pose no unreasonable risk to human health through a dermal inhalation or ingestion exposure pathway. What does that mean? And so generally what it means is that urban soils that have been subject to human use for decades or more, have accumulated over time certain contaminants, chemicals, etc., that the state has designated as something that needs to be managed so that they don't present human health or environmental hazards if they're not managed appropriately. So why is it an issue for brownfields? Why is it an issue for development in general? So because when you are developing property, you may have excess soil. And if you have excess development soil, you need to manage it appropriately so that it doesn't present a risk of harm to human health or the environment. There are currently opportunities for management of development soils. You can manage it on site. If you can somehow manage it on the site where you are developing it, and it poses no additional threat, then you can do that because it's the same standard, right? You're not contributing a new contaminated soil to a soil that might not be contaminated. You're using it where you got it, and it's got the same background level, the same contamination level. So you manage it on site, or you can take it to the landfill, or you can take it to what's called a categorical waste facility that has been approved for use just for this. And categorical waste facilities are a category of solid waste permitted facility that is not as vigorously permitted as, say, a full landfill, but still, when permitted, would pose no threat to most specifically groundwater. And there are categorical waste facilities around the state for things like stump dumps, construction debris, road debris, things of that nature. They need to be disposed of. They don't have to go to a fully permitted landfill. They can be managed in a different type of facility with minor risk.
Just backing up a second, because I just got hung up back there maybe a paragraph ago. Did you say that it can be mashed? I mean, this is what I heard that it could be matched with like development dirt?
Yes.
Okay. But
So if you're gonna-
would they both have to be tested to make sure that they're like?
Well, that is not necessarily. And so we're gonna get to that in a second.
Okay. Thank you.
So there is a fact sheet that the agency puts out. And one of the things that they list is a receiving site. This option allows for soils to be brought to a property that has concentrations of PAS, arsenic, or lead at concentrations equal or greater to those found on the origin development site and in concentrations above a soil standard. So you can take it to a place where it's actually at or above, so that receiving site, or take it to a categorical certification, to take it to a landfill, or use it as an alternate daily cover at a landfill or like place. But there still is not a lot of great options. There's no categorical facility that's been permitted for this. Landfill, that involves a lot of trucking, costs for disposal, etc. And then receiving sites, to my knowledge, you have to negotiate that, and that's to an extent what you're going to be approving here. It's going to be called an insignificant waste event. And that is something that ANR already has the authority in its solid waste management rules to authorize. And those are events where storage, treatment, collection, or processing of waste over a limited duration, ANR has determined will not result in a threat to the public health and safety or to the environment and will not create a nuisance. So what the language in 127 does, working off of the as-passed version, but in section 10, it says, notwithstanding any other requirements of this chapter, so notwithstanding any requirements for a categorical waste facility or a solid waste facility, development soils may be managed at a location permitted pursuant to an insignificant waste event. Remember, where ANR has determined that it can be managed for a limited duration and will not result in a threat to public health or safety or the environment and will not create a nuisance. However, they have to meet certain criteria in order to be authorized for the management of development soils at an insignificant waste event. They have to be generated from a hazardous materials site managed pursuant to a corrective action plan or soils management plan. That's a brownfield or a smaller urban development. The development soils have been tested for arsenic, lead, and PAS, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, pursuant to a monitoring plan approved by ANR that ensures that the soils do not leach above groundwater enforcement standards. And that's important because every action by ANR needs to maintain the groundwater safety and standards. The location where the soils are managed is appropriate for the amount and type of material being managed. Soils are capped in a manner approved by ANR. Any activity that may disturb the development soils shall be conducted pursuant to a soil management plan. And the permittee files a record of notice where the soils are managed in the land record. So subsequently, somebody wants to buy that property, they can go to the land records and know that there were development soils that were managed there according to an insignificant waste event.
What does capped mean?
It's covered. That soil will be.
That's what I thought, but I just wanted to.
It could be covered with podium parking on the new construction, right?
Yeah, it could be covered potentially with the development.
Yeah. It's a,
But if it is development, remember the disturbance of that soil shall be conducted pursuant to a soil management plan. So you probably aren't going to have a lot of development over these sites. You're probably going to have cover on the site. Probably doesn't mean that development won't occur somewhere else on the site, but you might have to manage that specific area according to the soil management plan.
in the real world, if I might ask, does this mean that a receiving site means someone who owns a receiving site is gonna have to have motivation here. And because they're gonna have a plan, it's money. So someone, well, would it also be a developer who has got a development where their balance of the site is such that they need dirt?
You could, I mean, if you're a developer and you want to shift your dirt pile from one to another because you need fill somewhere else. And it can be managed according to these criteria. Remember, according to these
Right.
criteria, it's not going to pose a threat to leaching to groundwater. You're going to have a cap on it. You're going to manage any disturbance according to the soil management plan. If you do all of those things, yeah, you can move it to the other development site and manage it according to those requirements.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So basically, it just adds that additional alternative for those urban developers who are running into the problem of managing these soils. So they don't have to truck it to a landfill or try to manage it on site in a way that might not be possible for confined spaces.
Great. Questions? Michael, thank you so much.
Gail had a
Oh, I'm
question.
sorry, Gail.
I had to piggyback on Elizabeth's question. I live in a community that's 183 acres. If the soil was tested in one spot, but was going to be
We can
removed
have her.
somewhere on
On the site.
the site, 100 acres away, does that have to be tested as well?
So if you're managing it on site, I generally I would defer to the agency here. I think there might be situations where you might have to test the receiving area, but I can't say for certain.
So why don't we cover that in subsequent testimony? I'm only rushing because Kathy Byer from Evernorth, as you anticipated, Matt, is only available to 11 until 11. So we're going to first, we're taking our witnesses out of order, but I hope that either Kathy or Matt will answer that question. So thank you so much, Michael.
You're welcome. Yeah.
I suspect you will be, this matter will be taken up in the Environment Committee one way or another.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Kathy, you want to introduce yourself? And we're tackling development soils because it wasn't in our housing bill, it is in the Senate housing bill, and that's what we asked the session on now.
Thank you so much, and thanks for getting me on. I have to be in House Energy at 11. I may try to come back around 11:30 to listen in again, but good morning. My name is Kathy Byer. I'm from Evernorth. I've been in your committee before, and I actually wanted to talk to you about the brownfields language found in S127 that is talking about a report from the Brownfields program. And I know that Director Matt Chapman is there, and I believe Trish Capolino. They are the experts. I am not the expert, but I wanted to introduce a concept for the committee to consider. And I apologize, I didn't get a chance to have this discussion with the Senate committee, but the Vermont Brownfields program, the DEC staff implement the program based on the remediation soil standards that are set by the Vermont Department of Health. So, for example, if you have a parcel with lead in your soils, the determination of the lead level that requires remediation is set by the Department of Health, not the DEC Brownfields program. And it's these standards that drive the extent of the remediation, and that means also drives the cost of the program. And for some reason, we haven't been talking about this in Vermont for many years, and partly because it's just very complex. It's, when you look at contamination standards, you're talking about measurements like parts per million, and it's hard to conceptualize what we're even talking about. And I think we'd all like to think like, well, let's remediate a parcel till we get to zero contamination, but that's just not really possible. So from a public policy perspective, the costs of brownfield remediation are really determined by the standard that's in place. And to date, the process of adopting these standards has not been transparent and has not involved a multidisciplinary approach. And I think that's because it is complex and it involves the risk of weighing public health against other public cost. I do understand that in some states, a more transparent and multidisciplinary process is used, and I just think it's time for Vermont to explore that. And I have talked with Director Chapman about this, and as I said, he is more the expert, but am hopeful that we might, sorry to spring this on your committee, but if we're going to have a report on the Brownfields program, it really needs to also look at how we are setting the standards for remediation. So I hope you will consider this, and like I said, I think Director Chapman can give you some more information on this.
Any questions? Kathy, good luck. I hope you are testifying in energy for the reasons I think you are. And we
Thank
have
you.
one question.
It's more for people around this table. That would just be a language change. It wouldn't be like a huge change to.
Well, the report could, I guess my first reaction is this is clearly something for the Environment Committee, not for our committee. I mean, I already think that the development dirt is for the Environment Committee, but we're hearing it because it's in the Senate bill. But I think that this, I know just what Kathy is referring to. The process of deciding what the right standard is has millions of dollars of implications on the development side. And you have to look at who's the maximally exposed individual. You know, is it a construction worker? Is it a kid eating dirt? What is it? And then you have to go backwards and figure out what the standard should be. But that means you have to figure out how much dirt they'll eat. And I mean, it really comes down to that kind of thing. And it is what Kathy is saying is it's time for revisiting it. And that's very much, I think, in the Environment Committee. The problem is it definitely affects the price of housing. There's no way around it in urban areas. Yes, Joe.
Is this a scenario where there's a federal standard and we're more restrictive? We certainly have that in other areas of contaminants.
In some cases, that is the case. Not in all cases, but
Yeah, I think it's mostly state.
It's mostly state.
I think it's mostly state. I have sat in a room, this is fairly early on, in a room with a Lazy Susan and little piles of dirt of different sizes and construction workers sitting around the pile with Department of Health people, not in the state, looking and asking the construction workers, which of these piles represents how much dirt you eat. I mean, it's interdisciplinary and scientific, but it's also, I'm not going to go further. Okay, so thank you, Kathy.
thank you for your time.
Matt,
Job specific amount.
they actually knew how much they used. I know.
Sure that no one- that we didn't like.
The same pile. Matt, you want to talk to us about development dirt?
I would love to. So for the record, Matt Chapman, I'm the Director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division at DEC. And with me today is Trish Coppolino, the Senior Environmental Program Manager from the Sites Management Program. And so Trish is basically going to jump in when I'm out over my skis and you have detailed questions that I can't answer. So I think Mike did a really great job of just sort of walking through the proposal that is in S-127. It basically is another option for developers so that to the extent there are site constraints or other constraints on their ability to manage this class of dirt, that they can try and find another option that basically reduces trucking costs, reduces project costs. So, I think the question with respect to, if you have a big property and you want to move dirt from one side of the property to the other, if the property is contaminated and you've tested, you're going to be doing all of that sort of under A&R supervision. So we're going to be managing what you're doing and where you're taking it and how it's basically dealt with on site under a planning process that we supervise. So, I guess I would just say, so Kathy and I spoke very briefly about her testimony, and I think, I guess I would say, and I know it's outside this committee's jurisdiction, two things. One is, with PAHs, arsenic and lead, these sort of development soil contaminants, I mean, we're really looking at values, at least right now, that are at the background value. So it's not like a health-based value. The health-based value is actually lower than the standards that Vermont uses. So in some respects, I think we should just put those a little bit in a box. But I do think that whether you're EPA or many other jurisdictions, they look at other factors when establishing standards, including technical feasibility, which we do. Sort of what's the capacity of the lab to test for it? What is the capacity of the treatment media to clean it up? They look at project costs, and I think that you look at what's going on regionally as far as the standards, and those are all things that were either this committee or the Environment Committee want to add to the study that's already in here. I've spoken with others at the Agency of Natural Resources, and I don't believe that that would be an issue. And I actually have language I could provide the Ledge Council on that as well.
Good. Question for you. I just want to understand again in the real world to make sure. Is this, I'm talking about the soils, development soils. So is my understanding right? This is material which is not particularly contaminated, number one. And number two, it's contaminated with stuff that isn't going to leach out into the groundwater.
So I think that with development soils, the contaminants that we're talking about, so arsenic for the most part is naturally occurring. We have high levels of arsenic in New England and in Vermont. So we often see those values above a health-based standard. We have lead, and we have a history of using lead, whether it be in paint or in gasoline or in other things, that makes it sort of ubiquitous in housing related areas where we're dealing with lead. And then PAHs are a fancy way of saying uncombusted carbon. It's basically from a tailpipe, from a wood stove. It's the ash that gets spread around. There's a large number of things that PAHs come from, but they're pretty ubiquitous in urban environments, frankly, even in rural environments. And so these are all things that when you're doing a project, you may find them. We have some streamlined ways to help you manage them, but they need to be dealt with. Your main concern, I think, as you pointed out, is ingestion, right? Like these are not really sort of an airborne or a groundwater issue. They could be if they're in high enough concentrations, but for the most part, we're looking at them as sort of a dermal ingestion pathway as far as the health impacts associated with them, which is why we're comfortable if these are put in the right spot, that there's some sort of appropriate cap placed on the top of them, that people have noticed that there's a material there, that this is an acceptable management approach for dealing with these
Who is on the other end? Let's say, because this is not the situation where it's all on one site. This is a situation where I'm a developer and I've got this excess state. So who's my buyer?
I mean, I think it's a wide range, right? It could be a V-Trans or a local municipality putting in a road or a parking lot and wanting to have some fill to level out areas. It could be another developer who has a need for fill and not for, they need fill. And it could be, frankly, someone who owns a property who just wants to level a portion of their property so that it's flatter, so that they can either farm it or put trees on it or whatever the ultimate land use they want to use on it is. I think all of those are potential options that are out there.
Questions, Matt?
So I have a question. So this is this is not going to affect, like when you tear down a factory or, somewhere where there's a really big excess, that there's an obvious like man-made, that by the very nature, we know that there's going to be very high levels of contamination. You're saying sometimes there just are levels just because of everything that's just regular run-of-the-mill existence of humans nearby, or, so like you said, it could be stuff that might have been airborne at some point and landed there, or are you?
So again, I think so these tools, I mean, they're for any redevelopment. They're not limited to housing, right? The contaminants that we're talking about are arsenic, lead, and pHs. So we're not dealing with asbestos, chlorinated solvents, all the sorts of other sort of more problematic contaminants that you may run across doing a redevelopment. Those are not included in this, and which is why I think it's important the way this is structured. The soil needs to come from a site that's under the agency's supervision, so that we are basically making sure that that basically there's not contamination that is along for the ride, so to speak, right?
Other questions? Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. As I told you, I will be transmitting this over, just not the whole bill. And Trish, thank you for coming along. But we'll be informing the Environment Committee of the
Sure.
matter.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, at this point,
Good morning.
good morning. Hey, Liz. Let's see. We have witnesses now. Are these the witnesses that are in connection with okay. So, but you're not testifying. So who's going to tell the committee what this is all about? Then get them, if you are, who are
No,
they?
they are.
They are, good.
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to our committee. I don't know, Liz and Jeremiah, have you appeared before this committee? Well, we'll introduce ourselves.
Good morning. I'm Representative Ashley Bartley. I serve the towns of both Fairfax and Georgia.
Hi, good morning, Lenora Dodge, Essex.
Joe Parsons, Newberry, Topsom, and Groton.
Tom Charlton, Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Windhoek.
Debbie Dolgan from St. Johnsbury, Concord, and Kirby.
Cal Pezzo, Chittenden 20, Colchester.
Mary Howard, Rutland City District 6.
Good morning, I'm Elizabeth Burrows and I represent Windsor 1.
And I'm Mark Mahaly, and I represent Calais, Plainfield, and Marshfield. So whichever of you wishes to speak first, have you figured that out?
We have.
Who is it?
So I'll start with an intro and then
Yes.
Jeremiah will take it from there and then I'll finish.
Great, thank you. Liz, introduce yourself and take it away.
Great, thanks. Magali, is the presentation up? Is the PowerPoint up?
It's on the committee website, yes.
Okay, great. So I'll
That doesn't
assume,
need it. That doesn't, does she have to share her screen to get it up?
Yes, I'll give you screen sharing
oh, I'm
privileges.
sorry. Okay, great.
I guess I should disclose to the committee that I still am the chair of a local committee in East Calais that redeveloped, as you know, we've talked about it, the store in East Calais. And we depended on a brilliant development person who essentially got us the grants that enabled to happen. And that development person was Liz Curry.
And I'm speechless. No, I'm sorry. I was not the only person. There were 3 of us who assisted with that, but I'm sorry. I am. Let me just start the share over. Okay, there we go. All right. Great. So Jeremiah Ward and I are going to talk about the manufactured home community sector in Vermont. It's a big and complex topic, so we're certainly not going to cover all the facets of it. This morning, we want to speak with you specifically about the sector as it relates to infrastructure funding, and the logos you see across the bottom are really just a overview of the funding, the agencies we work with and interact with around a lot of policy issues, funding issues, and other programs. I am Liz Curry. I have a consulting practice, Common Land Solutions, and I spent 20 years working in affordable housing development in the nonprofit sector in Northwest Vermont. And some of my work involved the acquisition and rehab of mobile home parks. That was in the last decade of the last century and the first decade of this century. And we didn't know a lot then that we know now. So it was a different time. And so it's been interesting kind of having that experience in the early part of the century versus what I'm doing now, which is assisting a lot of resident-owned parks with their needs because there's been a kind of explosion of resident-owned parks for reasons Jeremiah will discuss. So I'll just pass it over to you, Jeremiah.
Thanks, Liz, and hi, everyone. My name is Jeremiah Ward with the Cooperative Development Institute, and our nonprofit has been involved in Vermont since 2011, informing resident-owned communities. In the last 2 years, recognizing the need for infrastructure and funding for infrastructure projects in resident-owned communities, I launched a program called WISP, Water Infrastructure Support Program, that's USDA funded to help raise capital for these projects across New England, including Vermont. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a little bit, but pass it back to you, Liz.
Great. So we are members of the Manufactured Home Community Subcommittee of the Housing and Homeless Alliance of Vermont, and that's why we use acronyms. So the MHC Subcommittee is a group that meets once a month with staff from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, kind of convenes us and tracks us and what we're doing. And then other state agencies participate, and quasi-state agencies like VHCB and DHCA, nonprofit housing organizations that own and manage mobile home parks. VEIC is instrumental in developing a specific model of manufactured home that's very high efficiency and healthy. And then technical assistance providers like Jeremiah's organization, Cooperative Development Institute, UVM Center for Rural Development has been very engaged in researching the climate impacts on manufactured home communities. And then individuals like me and other folks who are working in this sector. So we're going to, so the subcommittee discusses a wide range of things, but mostly we look for opportunities like this one to move the needle on bringing an environmental justice lens to MHCs. Jeremiah will discuss some high-level background, and then we'll move quickly to our ask related to the SA 10, Chapter 120, subchapters 1 through 4. I've also shared some materials with Magali in your packet.
So yeah, to set the stage briefly, MHCs were generally built in the 1950s through the 1970s and became a critical source of affordable housing in Vermont. They continue to serve low-income populations, and the average median household income of MHCs that my program WISP has surveyed is $37,000. So as such, there's little room for MHCs to raise rents to pay for infrastructure upgrades, especially when you consider that the average MHC in Vermont is 30 households. So there's a very limited pool of people to spread costs among compared to a town which might have 1,000 households to spread costs among. The median Vermont lot rent is currently $413 per month. And that covers common costs to run the MHCs, provide the water, the sewer, plowing, et cetera. In addition to that, residents living in an MHC have oftentimes a loan payment on their home, which can range from $500 to $750 a month. And combined, the lot rent and those individual homeowner costs make the total housing cost for a household. And the mobile home loans for a resident tend to be pretty high interest rate. We've got a little snapshot here of almost 12% interest because they are considered like similar to vehicle loans, secured usually with a UCC lien. MHC infrastructure that serves communities was generally built in the 50s through 70s. So it's surpassed its useful lifespan. It's 50 to 70 years old. It was also generally, in many cases, poorly built back then because there were very few, if any, regulations governing the quality of how it was constructed. And the general infrastructure that we're talking about in MHCs is drinking water, wastewater, and electrical infrastructure, but increasingly stormwater infrastructure has been a focus and a need, both because of heavier rainfall events in recent years and to comply with the 3-acre stormwater permitting rule that was passed in Vermont. Vermont also has really strong opportunity to purchase laws that allow the MHCs that are currently privately owned, if they go up for sale, allow residents a path to pursue either becoming resident owned as a co-op or to become nonprofit owned.
I just want to mention to you that one of our members is a member of a co-op in a mobile home park.
Oh, Jeremiah knows me very well.
Okay, all
Hi,
right.
Representative Pezza. Go on
I'm
to the next
Jeremiah.
slide. Hey. Vermont has 238 MHCs that provide housing to nearly 7,700 households with low and moderate incomes. And 67 of these MHCs are already nonprofit or resident owned, serving 3,400 households, about 44% of the total. Vermont Housing Conservation Board has funded 52 nonprofit owned MHCs and some co-ops. And in that space of co-op and nonprofit owned parks, the big players are Addison Housing Works and Housing Foundation Institute are the bigger nonprofit owners of a portfolio of parks. And then Cooperative Development Institute, which has helped form 16 co-op MHCs in the state. And like I mentioned at the beginning, we've since launched a program dedicated to infrastructure fundraising for co-ops and also to serve some of the nonprofit parks as well. Next slide. As I alluded to, the infrastructure in these communities is aging, failing, and the cost to replace the infrastructure is considerable. A 2019 Vermont Housing Conservation Board report estimated that 25% of Vermont MHCs have needs of $200,000 to $3 million each. And that is a pretty substantial financial strain on an MHC, regardless of its ownership, because of how small they are and the challenges of getting the resources to pay for that work. Affordable housing grant programs like Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and VCDP lack the sufficient funds to pay for this amount of demand in MHCs themselves. And about 6 years ago, VHCB directed TA providers serving MHCs to also explore the state revolving fund program through DEC to supplement funding for these infrastructure projects because there's just not enough in the affordable housing world to pay for this amount of work. And there were two projects, one led by Addison Housing Works and one led by Liz for a co-op park in Milton that kind of went through the process of trying to use this state revolving fund source of money for big infrastructure upgrades in the middle of the pandemic. And those projects kind of shed light on how that SRF program really needs to be improved if this funding is going to be able to work with MHCs in the future. And I don't know if Liz, if you want to touch base on that really briefly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth spending a little time on this slide because it's attempting to convey a lot of information in a small space. First of all, when you look at this slide points out a 2019 report that the Housing and Conservation Board conducted or commissioned that's in your packet. And that report was an attempt to really take a look at the nonprofit portfolio across the state and all of the infrastructure capital needs, which go beyond water and wastewater. So things like roads, and some have steep slopes that might be eroding and various other issues. And the VHCB, I think, did that to get a sense of like, what is our total ecosystem of parks look like in terms of this money? How are we going to, manage these assets as a critical affordable housing resource? So just kind of thinking back to the slide where we showed you the lot rent of $413 and then the median lot rent, and then residents typically have a loan. So paying $1,000 for your housing is an amazing situation to be in these days as a household of, anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6 or whatever. So that just kind of illustrates how critical this housing resource is. But at the same time, people are living in a home that is physically deteriorating around them over that 20 years that they're paying 12% interest on a loan. So it's just a lot of issues you can see kind of bundled up there. But VHCB tried to assess the magnitude. And on the right, what you're seeing is kind of a pipeline of co-op parks and Addison Housing Work parks, where both entities have kind of looked at, what are we going to need to tackle in the next, hopefully only 10 years, if there's funding for all of these parks, or beyond that. But in the meantime, before these infrastructure needs are met fully, all of these parks are contending with regular failures and emergencies that cost them a tremendous amount of money. They have septic systems that I'm working in one park that go back 30 or more years, are completely over capacity, need pumping, need patchwork repairs, water systems that have old, like mid-20th century storage tanks, and the engineering mechanisms between the storage and pumping the water don't work anymore, and pipes are leaking all the time underground. So just to kind of give you a graphic illustration, parks are spending between $20,000 and $40,000 a year of their own operating costs on these emergencies. And that is why this issue is so critical, that the redevelopment happens at a pretty decent pace. And the SRF funds are a great resource for that. People were kind of kicking and screaming when VHCB said, we can't meet the needs of unsheltered folks and folks who need supportive housing and also fund these kinds of asset needs, these capital needs. And so everybody understood that. But then when we actually went to grapple with the program, we discovered that this program is not aligned at all well with the affordable housing industry needs, or just any park owner, for-profit or nonprofit, that would go to this program would need an engineering PhD to get through it. And the engineers would agree that we've just kind of ended up with a very complex and burdened program. And for MHC specifically, there are ways to simplify that in the statute and at least make the program more accessible for low-income groups. And when we went into Lindale at Addison Housing Works, which is on the chart to the right, and then the Milton Mobile Home Co-op in Milton, which is not on the list, we went through the whole program from the beginning to the end. And that's why we're here today, because of our experience doing that.
And just briefly on the SRF program, it is part of a federal program through EPA, where the authorizing federal statute is a Safe Drinking Water Act that creates a drinking water state revolving fund in every state, and the Clean Water Act, which creates a clean water state revolving fund in every state. And federal dollars from EPA flow into each state fund and mix with state funding. And as part of that process, every year, each state is required to produce an intended use plan to develop its list of priorities, requirements, criteria for projects it's going to fund for drinking water projects on the one hand and clean water projects on the other. And it's very clear when you read the federal statute and you read those intended use plans that the whole program is really designed for municipalities and rural fire districts. And in many states, that's still the only projects that are funded. Vermont does have the ability to provide funding, as we've mentioned, to MHCs, but the program is really still designed for municipalities. The governing statute at the state level that adds additional rules and in some cases constraints on the SRF program is Title 24, Chapter 120. And that's where the statute kind of spells out that municipalities have a process of going through the bond bank to get funding for their projects, whereas privately owned systems, including MHCs, get loans underwritten by the Vermont Economic Development Authority. And the program really is quite clunky when it pertains to MHCs. It doesn't work at the speed needed with these kind of emergency substandard systems that we see in MHCs, where, you know, you might have heard recently Sunset Lake in Heinsberg was on the news because a massive water line break occurred while we're trying to plan for SRF, but we just can't work at the slower speed at the SRF designed for municipalities typically works. So that's why we're here today, is to talk about.
Jeremiah, just a quick question is, you say privately owned systems, you mean is a co-op a privately owned system for those purposes?
Correct. Yeah. So
okay,
it's
so
a privately owned
actually what we think of as commercially owned versus and also co-op owned.
Correct. Yeah. In the SRF law, MHCs are considered, commercial, privately owned public water systems, as opposed to publicly owned public water systems are municipal owned or.
Okay.
Yep. And I think the next slide is yours, Liz.
Yeah. So just a few more points on this one. So Mark, that's a great question segue to help shape the committee's understanding of systems. So they're basically either municipal systems or they're not. And then if they're not municipal systems, there's all these subcategories, but you can imagine schools, homeowners associations, summer camps, RV parks, any, place that serves the public, all the commercial businesses. If they have a septic and a well, there are terms and conditions under which they can use these resources. MHCs are unique because they have residents that this is their housing. I mean, homeowners associations are in the same boat. They just tend to have higher incomes and less complexity in terms of the legacy infrastructure that they've inherited. So MHCs have inherited this very poor legacy infrastructure, and the people living there tend to have very low and low incomes. And if they're nonprofit or co-op owned, limited capacity in their ability to address all of these issues. And so when those of us who work with these parks get into the issues, we need to move along at a fairly fast pace to help resolve these issues. And municipalities don't need to move at that fast pace. In fact, I would say that most municipalities don't want to move at that fast pace. It's more digestible for the residents and voters to kind of think about how they want to either expand or repair or replace or build their infrastructure in a pace that aligns with their ability to increase, to absorb water rates or water rate increases or whatever's going to repay the bond. So the two sectors differ in terms of that urgency, that sense of urgency. And when you have a program designed for municipalities, that sense of urgency is not there. And there are places in the chapter, in chapter 120, where we believe there could be tweaks to kind of elevate the more urgent needs of MHCs. But, of course, I'm not sure it would be aligned with federal regulations to just call out MHCs in the chapter. So we're not asking for an MHC designation per se necessarily, but more around, for example, Maine has a carve out for privately owned public water systems. And so it really kind of addresses MHCs under that broader heading. What we've done here is just to kind of highlight how Act 154 of 2022 is the environmental justice legislation that all agencies have been asked to integrate into their policies and procedures. And we are looking at this chapter as an opportunity to blend some of those principles into the really subchapter 3 and 4, which pertain to the privately owned systems. So specifically, I want to point out that in subchapter 1 in definitions, municipalities have a category of hardship or disadvantaged based on the incomes of those residents. And then, of course, they're paying through water rates, they're repaying the bond for the infrastructure. And then that water rate has to be a certain percentage of people's income to become a hardship or a disadvantaged community. We're saying that parks rely on lot rent to repay infrastructure loans, and that that can, the costs that they're facing with all their emergencies and their needs can be a hardship until they get a loan and stabilize that. Now, the current staff recognize a lot of this. We've had these discussions with them and they've been receptive to the cases that we've made, but it's really at their discretion. And so we're just saying that the staff right now have come to the table and willing to discuss this. And so for our projects, they have demonstrated flexibility in terms of recognizing the needs and the hardships when it comes to structuring the loan, but that's not a guarantee. And it can be a distraction to have to go off and beg them for that flexibility when we're just trying to get a project done. In subchapter 3, the loan priorities for privately owned water systems are based on a set of criteria, but that criteria, there's a range of loans in the program. You can do planning loans and construction loans. But the criteria for the loans doesn't recognize financial hardship of paying for all the emergencies, repairs, and maintenance over the course of 1 or 2 or 3 years that it takes to get from a planning loan to a construction loan. And so without a priority system that recognizes, it'll recognize health hazard or failures that are other types of failures, but it doesn't recognize the financial hardship the way in the definitions that is recognized for municipalities. And so we're asking for that criteria to be added, that the financial hardship of their current system creates a pressing need to elevate that applicant as a priority. In subchapter 4, these are privately owned clean water systems, which means wastewater. And it specifically says that no wastewater project authorized under the subchapter shall be prioritized above a municipal clean water project. And this is really problematic because, it's the same issue again. It just means that we wait in a queue in terms of loan applications. We wait in a queue, and every year, if municipalities are ahead of us, then you're placing this burden, this disproportionate burden on low-income people to kind of contend with these costs, raise lot rents, and go to their residents for more and more money. And interestingly, Representative Pezzo solved this problem for her former MHC and became a village. So now Westbury, should they have these kinds of very expensive and intense infrastructure needs, would be ahead of themselves had they remained a bit MHC. So that's just a kind of a ironic way of showing what the issue is. So that's really the gist of it. Those are kind of the places in the subchapter where we see opportunities to embed some of the environmental justice principles that would recognize the hardships that MHCs contend with.
Are you proposing essentially that there be a bill which would revise the statute?
That some of this language could be embedded, yes.
Do you have text?
We did send a memo earlier on Monday, I believe, that since then I've had the opportunity to go back and forth with Deputy Commissioner Neil Kamen, who has been he's recently been made Deputy Commissioner, and he's been incredibly supportive and receptive because he was working in the program with us over the past couple of years. And so now that he's Deputy Commissioner, I just want to say that these kinds of things collided or coincided, really, that we had this teed up before Neil became Deputy Commissioner. And so this was on its own train track. And then Neil became Commissioner. And I said, this is nothing on you, that we're not doing this because you haven't been supportive. But before Deputy Commissioner Kamen was in his seat, we were not getting traction. We were not getting heard. We were not getting receptivity from former commissioners. And it was not a priority to them to listen to us for the past 2 years. But Neil and his staff did listen, and they have been receptive. It's just that many of the things we're asking them for can be resolved in that intended use plan that was brought up earlier, the state's plan for the federal money. And so we are excited about continuing those conversations with the staff for things that we can change in the intended use plan. And there's many more things that we would like to change that can be handled that way. But these specific asks are related to embedding some of the environmental justice law in the statute so that they're not discretionary.
So the memo that you're discussing with Neil is not, doesn't involve statutory change.
It did propose some, but I will say that the language was a little rough because our conversations hadn't gone as far. So we could revise the memo for you to simplify it. It's really just, it was too much. This simplifies it to just these specific requests.
I know I'm sounding a bit reductionist here, you'll forgive me. But what a committee always wants to know is, what do you want from us now?
Yes. So we would like a definition for disadvantaged privately owned public water systems, or those that have a hardship. And we would like that to be based on the median income levels in that owner's park or system, in that owner's system. And then we would like, in these 2 subchapters, we would like language that indicates MHCs are a priority if they have financial hardship, if they are in the disadvantaged category. And we would like the subchapter 4 to remove the language that says, in no cases shall MHCs be considered a priority ahead of a municipality, or remove the municipality as ahead of the MHC. Because there's other criteria in the statute that allow the secretary to say, this municipality is, I'm sorry, this is a priority. We're not going to, like Heinsberg with the Sunset Terrace, the secretary would have said, no other MHC is going to be ahead of this town of Heinsberg's need right now to fix this water line, understandably. So the secretary has other ways of establishing that a municipality is a priority at any time. It's just that if it's in the statute, there's no real guidance, or I should say there's too much guidance that diminishes the needs of MHCs.
Is there, so to see if I understand, what you're suggesting, what you want from us now is statutory language revisions dealing with the definition of disadvantaged MHC and changed priority and to remove the priority for municipalities. Do you have any idea of the position of the League of Cities and Towns on this issue?
No, we don't. We haven't spoken with them.
Okay. Is there, do you have, but you're not asking for us that a certain percentage of the money be set aside for disadvantaged MHCs?
No, and in fact, that's in the annual intended use plan. And again, the secretary always has the ability through a range of other criteria in the statute to, signal that municipalities are going to get the go ahead.
Members of the committee. Questions? I would think my first thought is this would require additional testimony if we were to do this. We might even have to listen even more than we already do to one of our members. And we would probably have to hear from the league as well. Do you have any other thoughts, Liz, before you go, either of you, as to next steps?
Well, we plan to continue discussing our requests with the Water Investment Division with the Deputy Commissioner and his staff. So we plan to do that. And I think other committees, if we can discuss with them as well, would involve maybe House Environment or whatever our subcommittee assistant Chad from VHFA recommends.
Right. Okay. Any other questions of either of these witnesses? Yes.
One of my constituents, who directs one of the food shelves in Essex, was actually really moved by a short film that seemed to be in part about this situation. Remember that I asked you about?
Recently?
Yeah.
That was a village film.
Yeah, but it touched on the water. Yeah, so just wanted to say there's a really cool movie out there, and if
It's a great
y'all could
film.
send us the link again for the committee to watch to understand why, how it affects people on the ground. And thank you for your efforts, Liz.
Any other committee questions? Both of you, thank you so much for
Thank you.
taking the time to raise this issue and educate us on something which I at least knew almost nothing.
Well, thank you so much for giving us the time to talk with you today.
Yes,
Great.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So I guess while we're still online, I'd appreciate any thoughts the committee has. My first reaction is I think this would have to go to environment. In other words, it involves a very important housing sector. But I think since I'll check, but I'm assuming drinking water is in the purview of environment and A&R. And I don't think this could be a drive-by, or what do we call it? Flyover. A flyby. I don't think so. Which means that I don't think it probably should be in our omnibus housing bill, because that would substantially delay the housing bill. But I'm not sure, and I will, telling all of you, I will talk with the chair of the Environment Committee. and see, what her preferences are, if any. But before I go ahead and do any of that, I would like to hear from the committee as to your thoughts on this issue. Is this something that matters to you? Is this a priority in any way? What are your thoughts? Gail?
Well, of course, I'm gonna say it's a priority. Regarding mobile home communities, it's big. There's so many issues. This water issue, I think after you get the information, this is something that may have to go into that bill that you and I are thinking about. I also want to make clear that some of the things that Liz had said, Westbury is a very unique property. So not every mobile home park community can become an incorporated.
Yeah.
They can, but they have to weigh the cost and benefits on whether it makes any sense for them to do so. It also took 4.5 years of work. So, and that's, not hiring attorneys. So I just want to make that clear. I do have that also on the website, the Mobile Home Task Force, to show that Westbury was unique and was able to do it. It's also a park of 250 units. It's large. It's, larger than many towns in Vermont. The water issue is the one that I'm still working on. It's very difficult to get the water, Champlain Water District. They don't want to give you the wholesale rate. And Westbury will be the only incorporated village that's not getting the wholesale municipal rate. So it's a big struggle. Many people don't know anything about mobile home communities.
One possibility, just to make clear what Gail's referring to, there are a number, our concern, I'm speaking for myself as a committee member. My concern for mobile homes is for all the obvious reasons that you've heard. They're a source of low-income housing in Vermont and inexpensive. As expensive as it is for the residents, it's still inexpensive compared to $600,000 per unit or whatever it costs. In our bill and approved are processes that give under MER that give money to individual mobile home owners for foundations and repairs and to parks. But this is another matter entirely. One of the things that Gail and I have talked about is there are other problems besides this one, including something that was alluded to. These loans for mobile home owners are very expensive because a lot of them they don't treat mobile homes as real estate. They treat it as personal property. And so the loans are, even though they're secured, they're 12% or in that.
And that's if you can get them because you don't own the property.
Right. And
So there's very few banks that will even give you the loan.
Right. So I am familiar with this because I lived on a houseboat. And a houseboat is identical. You lease the space and then you own the houseboat. And when you go to get a loan, guess what? There's like one bank that will give you the loan. And so they charge what they're going to charge. And they're just not used to ground lease situations. They're uncomfortable with that. And as you know, banks, once they're uncomfortable, the rate goes way up. So anyway, we were thinking that next session, we would introduce a bill, which could be a committee bill or it could be individuals that would address a panoply of issues. But when she referred to a conversation, I just wanted to make that too. Yes.
Does any of this connect with the tips or the hits or the infrastructure? Like, will there be tax advantages extended to?
I think the TIF and the tax abatement programs could be written to apply, but I don't think. The problem is that's all about new construction.
Well, but we're gonna lose housing.
Right, but it's all about new construction. It doesn't work with existing projects very well because the tax increment is the difference between the tax now and the elevated tax later that comes from development. So I don't think you get much increment at all off of the site.
It may not be an advantage because there's no, let's say, appreciation, for lack of a better terminology.
Other thoughts by the committee before I sort of go looking for what the situation is? Anyone want to tell me they don't care about this and that shouldn't be?
No, this is important to the housing side.
I mean, seriously, I'm asking you seriously. I don't want to.
Well, if we don't deal with their infrastructure issues, we lose more units,
Yeah.
which is kind of bad timing.
Yeah, and I don't know. Okay. Well, we're going to reconvene tomorrow morning. And our first testimony tomorrow morning is after lunch at 1:00. We will be discussing S-127 because we've heard a lot of testimony and doing a walkthrough with Cameron and a markup. Any final questions?